Hi, welcome back again. This week I'm going to be doing a more contemporary figure for you again. I have got this GI here, and he is from the Vietnam era, you can see. This particular model is by Baker Company, which is a new manufacturer for me. I have not painted any of their sculpts on my channel before. But I've had a lot of requests for more Vietnam era figures, also some Viet Cong. I've already done actually a tutorial on a Vietnam era Special Forces soldier, and I will link to that in the description box if you want to see some kind of interesting camo from that period. And I also painted a modern sort of commando wearing sort of a forest type pattern camouflage, which was also pretty common in the Vietnam sort of war and was used a lot by Special Forces and also normal soldiers. But I'm going to be painting this GI in the most sort of boring standard uniform, so we're looking at, kind of olive drab greens. It's a fairly simple, straightforward outfit. I don't think it'll take too long. I do, as you may have noticed, well, you can see I have not painted my soldier's skin, and I thought I would do him in a darker skin tone for a change, kind of go for African American here, because I haven't done that all that often. I have one kind of on doing Zulu Warrior that's kind of related, but I thought it would be good to kind of revisit that topic as well. So this tutorial is going to cover that darker skin tone along with the uniform, since that's I think this is going to be a fairly simple figure, but hopefully one that will be useful to people, because I know what a demand there is for tutorials on painting these kind of more recent uniforms. So let's see, I think that's a bit about all, so let's go ahead and get started. So when it comes to painting African American skin tones, there's obviously a huge range of possibilities, from much sort of darker tones to very light tones. So if you're going to be doing it frequently, I recommend actually that you come up with a range of possibilities, some different combinations you can use, so that you can have kind of a diverse looking sort of unit. The color I'm choosing to go for here as my base, though, is Vallejo chocolate brown. Next, I'm going to help darken things down a bit by applying a wash, and a normal Reichland Fleshblade won't do here, so I've mixed some black in. I'm now going to start lightening the skin, and I am going to make my first highlight by mixing a bit of Vallejo cork brown into my chocolate brown. Not too much here to start out. I'm going to keep it pretty subtle. And my chocolate brown is also kind of transparent because it's a new bottle. It's not mixed very well, so I had to apply a couple layers to get this as thick as I wanted. But anyway, you can go ahead and sort of smooth this pretty much over most areas of the skin, blending it sort of outwards on sort of the undersides, areas that are in a deep shadow. And on the face, of course, you're always going to want to emphasize the nose, the lips, the chin, the top of the cheekbones, and sort of blending down from there along the bottom of the jaw, and of course around those ears. Now I'm going to apply an extra dark shade color to places like between the fingers, inside the mouth, around the eyes, under the nose, and the bottom lip, those kinds of things. Normally I use Vallejo red or black red for this, but I don't feel that works very well with this skin tone, so instead I'm using German camouflage black brown, and that might even be a little bit too light to get a really good contrast, so you may want to darken it down even further with a little bit of black if you find that helpful, just to make it really show up well. I'm then going to continue highlighting further, and I've just basically taken the color I had before, the chocolate brown and the cork brown. I've just added even more cork brown into it to lighten it further, and I'm going to continue applying it now, focusing on areas where I want there to be more light hitting, where I want to feel brighter. So you can see I'm focusing on the fingertips and the top of his arms. Obviously, again, kind of concentrating more and more on the nose, the cheeks, the lips, the tips of the ears. Don't forget to do, especially when the figure is like this, kind of with a very short hairstyle, to do the sort of the back of the head or the neck, wherever that's showing. But again, you want to start out kind of lightly and sort of gradually build the color up so that you get a lot more sort of range of color. So put it on, thin it first, and then go back in as needed and lighten it even more to add extra color and brightness. At this point I'm working with pure cork brown. I haven't cut it at all with chocolate brown, and I'm using it as a really sort of high highlight color on fingers and whatnot. And even though it's a pretty bright light brown color, because we're applying it over such a dark base, it won't build up or appear too light too quickly. So, you know, you might think, oh, I put that on, he's going to get lighter than I want him to do. It's not really going to happen that way unless you really layer it on heavy. So, you know, you've got some freedom there, especially if you plan to blend it out. You can get some really nice transparency going. And I'm, again, just continuing as I did in my last step, building it up on those areas where I really want light to be hitting. At this point, I really am, for the most part, only focusing on the parts of the face that really stand out, and or just physically stand out, or just where you want there to be extra emphasis because they're important features and you want to draw attention to them and make sure people focus on them. Now, you don't really have to do this, but if you want to add even more contrast and more emphasis, you can keep going. I decided I would add one more really minimal highlight. This time I took a little bit of Iraqi sand and mixed it into my cork brown, and I'm going to just really only apply this to sort of the nose, the ears, the lips, and the chin, those kinds of things. Just small dabs of it, really, and maybe just a little tiny bit on the ends of the fingers. But at this point, you know, you don't want to go too much with this kind of light color, because you want to preserve the sort of nice dark rich skin tone that we've got going on here. So, you know, just use this just really sparingly, but it'll really sort of help bring everything together and sort of bring out the overall look of the face. I'm pretty happy with my skin tone now, so I'm going to work on painting the uniform. It's actually very, very simple. It's all very much the same color. I'm going to do a few tricks just to get a little bit of variation, but you know, we're going to start out here by using a base coat of Vallejo Camouflage Olive, which is a kind of, you can see a nice sort of dark, sort of dark indeed olive green color. You want to put this all on his pants and his shirt and his helmet. You can also put it on his equipment, though we're going to paint it a little bit differently, but probably in this case you want to err on the side of caution and maybe cover those areas too, just, you know, in case you forget to paint somewhere. You know, it's better to have a more complete base coat than a lacking one in these situations. Now I'm going to wash the uniform using a mixture of Citadel Coelia green shade and Nuln oil. So I'm getting a real black-green color, and you can see that really helps to add extra contrast into all of the deep recesses and wrinkles and folds in the uniform. I'm going to start highlighting now, and I am using my camouflage olive here again, and I am lightening it here using Vallejo Russian Uniform World War II, which is just, it's similar in tone to the camouflage olive, but a bit lighter, maybe a little bit grayer. So this first highlight just mixes a little bit into the darker color, so it's just a little bit lighter. And at this stage I'm just going to be layering it pretty much everywhere, just kind of staying away from all of the seams and recesses, all those areas that I really want to kind of use as dividing lines in the uniform. But otherwise you can kind of apply it everywhere, at least thinly. You know, start thinking about blending it out into the really dark areas, so that when we go up to higher highlights, you already will sort of have that work done, and it'll be easier, and you won't have to make such extreme transitions, you know, if you're doing it at this stage already with this fairly subtle color. The second highlight is just the exact same thing, except I've mixed a bit more of the Russian Uniform World War II into my camouflage olive, so it's just a little bit lighter, and I'm just continuing to build it up over large areas and sort of blend it out into the areas where I want to maintain shade and shadows, especially the more heavy contrast shade areas. So, you know, like there's some very slight, subtle wrinkles on the fronts of the pants and stuff, but we're not going to worry about those so much yet. So we're just kind of painting over them, but all the real deep areas, you know, we're going to make sure we kind of blend out into those, like under his sleeves or between his legs, that kind of thing. And places like his helmet, of course, again, there's a lot of light hitting, so you're going to really want to make sure that you paint pretty much that whole thing. But this figure has so many sort of seams and pouches and real clear lines sort of showing where different parts of the uniform are. It's pretty straightforward. You just sort of follow along and sort of work around those just to kind of define your uniform. And you don't really need to spend a lot of time doing sort of blending over big areas, which is of course where things kind of can get tricky. This third highlight has completely now eliminated the camouflage olive, and I'm just working purely with Russian uniform World War II here, layering it now really more in a more focused way, I should say, onto sort of the tops of creases and folds and areas where light would be hitting. And at this point I really am starting to think about emphasizing highlights rather than just sort of blending out the shadows or just sort of covering all areas that are not, wrinkles or folds. So you can see me putting emphasis on all the seam edges and on knees, on calves, on all the creases in the pants, and especially the sort of the rolled up sleeves, the top of the helmet. Starting to apply the paint like an edge highlight. Even though I'm going to apply more edge highlights in the future and lighten it further, at this point you want to start sort of using the paint more like an edge highlight. You can see I'm applying it like to those pouch pockets and blending it out quite a bit, but always sort of starting from the edges and the dividing lines and sort of smoothing it out from that point. And to refine it further and to get even more sort of lightness in my color, I've now mixed Vallejo green gray into my Russian uniform World War II. And I'm just proceeding as I was before, but just sort of just applying the paint in less and less places, blending it out more and more, just being a little bit more sparing, a little bit more subtle, just, continuing that sort of gradual build up that we want to do in order to get an interesting sort of varied looking uniform with like a good range of shadows and highlights on it. And this is really my final highlight, which is really more green gray with just a little bit of the Russian uniform mixed into it, so it's quite a light color. And I'm now going to be using this really as an edge highlight. It's really my final edge highlight, I guess I should say, on areas that should be sort of really extremely colored, and even on the knees too, because I always put a lot of emphasis on knees just because I think they often stick out, but they often get worn and faded as sort of in relation to other parts of the uniform because they rub against things, people kneel down, that kind of thing. So you can always sort of lighten and overemphasize them a little bit. You can see he's also carrying sort of a satchel, and I decided I would paint it in the same color as the rest of the uniform because I saw some pictures kind of look like that. So that's what I'm doing here. So I'm using the same palette on it and applying these same edge highlights here. But this color, maybe not strictly necessary. I think it does add just a little bit of extra detail, especially if you really only apply this in very thin, sort of transparent lines where where there's this sort of a clear switch between the light and the really dark shadows and sort of seams. I want his backpack, water bottles, and sort of belt and pouches to be ever so slightly different shade. I looked at a lot of photos of this, and there was a lot of variation in how the colors of these uniforms and the colors of different pieces of equipment looked from one another. But at the same time, what they all had in common is they were all very, very much olive drab with just some very sort of subtle shade shifts going on. So I'm base coating these here with a mixture of khaki and again that Russian uniform World War II, because I decided I wanted the equipment pieces here to maybe be a little brown, a little bit more yellow in tone than the other parts of the uniform. Further emphasize that whole kind of brown yellow thing as opposed to a more green tone, I'm also washing these areas with a fairly heavy coat of Agrax Earth Shade. My first highlight here is going to take the khaki, and I'm using some green gray to lighten it up, because the khaki by itself is probably just a bit too brown, and I do really want this to feel more green than I do brown or gray here, so that's why I've chosen that as a lightening color. At this point it's pretty subtle, and again I'm really applying it everywhere, just kind of skipping all of the clear lines or seams or really dark areas on the equipment packs, basically. To continue lightening and highlighting these areas, I'm going to take the color I just had, which is again the khaki with that green gray in it, but I'm going to start lightening it now using some buff. And buff is obviously sort of a light creamy yellow color, but by mixing this kind of browny green color, it's not, especially if you start out subtly, it's not going to make it bright yellow all at once, but it's going to start adding a very clear yellow cast to what you're doing. But yellow is nice here because it works well with sort of the greenishness, you know, it sort of fits in there. And, you know, you can see it's actually quite similar to the color of his uniform, but you can see it's slightly different. It's just slightly more yellow, what we're starting to get here, and that's what we want. We want it to be almost the same, but just ever so slightly different. And I'm just now applying it to sort of all the higher sort of light areas where light's going to be hitting. On the backpack, which is kind of a big smooth surface, I'm sort of using it to define some very soft, gradual wrinkles, sort of very subtly adding patches of it there and blending it out. Most of the other areas are so small, you can just sort of apply it along sort of the edges and it'll just kind of work out. My final highlight on the equipment is the same idea, but just even lighter with even more buff mixed into it, so it's quite bright. You can do this as many times as you want. It depends on just how big a step you want between the look of the equipment and pouches and the look of the uniform. I'm not going to go any further than this because I want it to stay a little bit subtle. I don't want there to be too extreme a gap in the color tones here, but this final highlight, you can see we're getting a really pretty good noticeable green, brown, yellow tone to these pieces of fabric. Now I really opted here only to work with sort of two different tones of green, yellow, but you know, you could make more. You can make more different, slightly different shades on. So have some piece of equipment be maybe more brown, some be even more green, some be more yellow. That's really up to you. I think it's a sort of a compromise in terms of, you know, how much time you want to spend, you know, how long you want these to take. The more different shades of equipment you have on your guy, obviously the more time and more trouble one of these figures is going to take. For me, I found like two different sort of green khaki shades was the right amount, but you know, if I was doing this figure for presentation or, you know, in certain situations, I might, you know, work harder to come up with more distinct tones on the, you know, just the different areas of the uniform. There's some areas that I want to be a very, very dark, almost black green, which includes the straps on his backpack, the sort of band on his helmet, the top of his water bottle, some areas just like that. So I've just made a mix of the camouflage olive here and some black, actually a lot more black than camouflage olive at this point because I want it to be very dark, and I'm just going to apply it on to those areas. I'm also going to be putting a camouflage cover on his helmet because they seem like they very often were camouflage colored, and they use sort of this sort of just all green sort of splashy camo pattern, but often on these helmets or in photos you'll see that the pattern gets really faded and worn really quickly, so the color sort of accuracy that's going to suffer really quick, so you don't have to be really exact about how you do it. So I'm going to use this really dark black brown, or I should say black green, to make some spots on the helmet, because the helmet pattern usually seemed to have these very dark black green spots as part of the pattern. So I'm using the same color and applying just some blobs here and there over top of the helmet. You can then highlight all of these areas if you want, just with some of the camouflage olive, maybe with just a little black to make it darker, and then finish off just with pure camouflage olive, or even lighten it slightly with just a little of the green gray, kind of to your taste. Now the other element to the camo helmet is it had sort of a medium green. It's in general a very dark black green in it, and then also a very, very light, kind of bright or whitish green, depending on which one you look at. I'm not being too precise here. I'm just kind of improvising with the colors I have. Basically, this color, usually there was quite a lot of it. And of course, since we're working on such a small area, we don't really get a chance to really define how the camo pattern really looks. We're just trying to get some sort of rough blobs of color. I have made this basically by taking some of the green-gray color, which is quite light, mixing a little German camouflage bright green just to get a slightly different cast, and then applying that sort of as a base in big splotches on the helmet. I'm then going to highlight it by mixing in white to lighten it, and I found actually to get enough contrast in those sort of spots with the sort of medium green, I actually had to lighten it substantially. So before you're done, you're probably going to end up with a very pale pastel minty green almost, and you may want to apply several layers of sort of succeedingly light green just so that you can get some extra highlight, like for the top of the helmet or right around the edges. But you know, I found it really, you have to add quite a surprising amount of white to get a high enough contrast for these areas. But the bottom line is you should end up with a helmet that sort of has a mixture of splotches of the sort of the base green of his uniform, some then very black green splotches, and then a very white pale sort of splotch. And you want sort of proportionally more of the white light green splotches and the dark splotches, and then the medium green splotches should be smaller and a little more subtle and less evident in the uniform. Now I'm going to base coat the black and leather areas in this figure, which include mostly his boots in this case. He's also got some sort of things under his helmet band, which I think are probably shotgun shells. It's a little bit hard to tell. But anyway, I'm going to just base coat those areas, yeah. And so at this point, you could just go ahead and lob on some black paint. And then I'm going to start highlighting with just Vallejo German gray. At first, just sort of picking out or just painting all the areas that are not sort of seams or creases, just applying it everywhere. And on the sort of shells or the things under his hat band, pretty much the whole area, except really just right down at the base of them, because you want it to really look like it's in some shadow. And then I'm going to continue highlighting by mixing a little bit of neutral gray into my German gray to lighten it just a little bit. And I'm going to use that sort of to start highlighting, especially the boots a little bit, applying it sort of to toes and the soles, and sort of anywhere there's the sort of tops of folds or along seams, things like that. And this is still a pretty subtle shade, so you can also use it as sort of a final highlight on the shells. Just a tiny dot on the tops is really all you need. I'm going to then finish off by just taking some pure neutral gray. I'm not going to use this on the shotgun shells because I think they're light enough already, but I'm going to apply that on the boots, definitely, like on the toes and the heels and such, just to get a nice extra light highlight color going that's going to put emphasis on them, because that's leather and it's a little bit shiny, but you don't need it on the shells again. Also, you can choose to paint these like swamp boots, or jungle boots, I guess I should say, which was something that they started wearing in Vietnam. I am not going to do that. They had kind of cloth uppers, actually. And yeah, I'm not doing that here, but you can check out my other tutorial on a Vietnam sort of commando guy if you want to see how to do that style of boot. There's one final sort of pack, I guess, under our soldier's headband here. I'm not sure what it is. I think it might be a medical sort of first aid kit, so I'm going to paint it like that. So I'm going to just base coat this real quick using pure Vallejo khaki. And I am then going to highlight it first, and it's not a big area, so this should be quick. Just highlight it real quick first with Iraqi sand, sort of especially on the top, and then finish off just by mixing a little bit of white into the Iraqi sand to get extra light pale color, and just sort of dotting that sort of very lightly, sort of along the very top edge. I'm now going to work on the stock of our soldier's shotgun here. I am base coating here with Foundry Bay Brown shade, and I'm just going to apply it just all over that sort of area. Once I've got that on, I'm going to start highlighting, and I'm going to first take Foundry Chestnut Brown shade. This is what I usually do basically when I'm painting wood, and I'm going to apply it to all the edges lightly and sort of blend it out into the dark areas, sort of build it up so that I get it quite bright at the edges and just sort of fades out and gets more subtle sort of as you go away. And then I'm going to finish up in that sort of same way by taking Foundry Chestnut Brown medium, and I'm going to use it as an edge highlight, really more applying it just along the edges of the wood. Still, again, blending out, doing the same thing I just did, but just doing it less, doing it a little bit more subtly, and really, making more clearly defined lines with it where, there's a break in the wood, or, we changed over to a different material. I'm going to finally finish off here by doing the metal part of the gun, which I'm going to base coat with a mixture of Vallejo German Gray and a Vallejo Air gunmetal, obviously more German Gray than gunmetal, as I always say, so you get a real dark metallic gray color. Just base coat that. I'm then going to make a highlight, and I'm going to do this a little different than usual. Normally I just go right up to Vallejo Air gunmetal, but I don't want it to get quite so bright, so I'm going to take the Vallejo Air gunmetal at this time and just mix a little of the German Gray just to darken ever so slightly, because I want a little bit more of a subtle highlight. And I'm just going to sort of lightly brush that onto areas where I want to emphasize, just so you get a real subtle sort of gradation going on there. And then I'm going to finally take just some pure gunmetal, and I'm going to apply it quite sparingly, just really as an edge highlight, sort of at the end of the barrel and where there's some sort of breaks in the metal. And there's only really a couple, but I am going to avoid just applying it sort of mass along the top of the barrel. You can also take some of that sort of subtle highlight color that you just mixed with the German Gray and use it if you want to highlight slightly those shells, give them a little bit of a metallic look as well. Okay, so here's our finished Vietnam era US GI figure. He was actually quite simple to paint, in my opinion, and we only really worked with a very small number of colors. There's only a very small number of different sort of things happening in this uniform, but I think it still manages to look, nice and sort of really clean, and I think a lot of that is just because we took time in painting it and shading it. We used a lot of different sort of steps in the color, so even though there's not a lot of different things, it's very, I feel it's kind of calm. There's a sort of a nice unity to it, and it just looks nice and well painted, even though it's just a fairly simple technique and not a lot of variety in color. And I think also this skin tone worked out really well. And as I said, this is really just one possible approach to doing darker skin tones. There are a ton of different color combinations that would look great. And as I said, I encourage you to develop several different color combinations just so that you can have more variety, because people look really different, and you shouldn't just paint like have one set of colors for painting people like who are African American, one for painting white people, one for painting Asian people, or whatever. I mean, it saves time, but if you want to start getting a force that looks more realistic and more interesting, the more sort of different skin tones and shades you can come up with, kind of the better it's going to look. So this is just one potential sort of extra way you could do that. You can sort of add into, your repertoire, and you can check out some of my other skin painting tutorials for some slightly different kind of variants that you can work with. So if you enjoyed this video, as always, please like it, share it, leave comments for me, let me know what you thought of it. Do please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already, so you can, keep up with the latest developments. And I will be seeing you next time.